Hello and welcome to the WEC Sim CodeStructure portion of the online training materials. If you're trying to gain a deeper understanding of how the WEC Sim code fits together, perhaps you'd like to contribute to the repository, or perhaps you're just trying to debug a model. This is the right place to be. I'm Dominic Forbush of Sandia National Laboratories. Thank you for joining me. First, let's get some vocabulary out of the way. When you first download WEC Sim, the directory into which all of the code goes will be referred to as the source code directory. That contains things like the WEC-Sim Executable and various subdirectories containing other aspects of the WEC-Sim code. When you run a particular model, the directory from which you run that model is referred to as the case directory. This contains things like the WEC-Sim input file and the particular Simulink model you're trying to run, as well perhaps as subdirectories containing hydrodynamic data and geometric data. Note that the required model files are captured in the table there. However, it is possible that you might have more files that are necessary for your model. A number of these are covered in our advanced features. And with that, let's delve more deeply into the WEC-Sim source code. In order to run WEC-Sim, it's recommended that you add the source code directory and all of the supporting Simulink libraries to your MATLAB and Simulink paths, respectively, by following our installation instructions. Note that many of the code objects, the .m files that are contained in the WEC-Sim library, are objects. These are things like the body class or the wave class. The methods and properties of these objects require that the object itself be initialized before use. This is usually done in the WEC-Sim input file. To run WEC-Sim from the command window, you'll navigate to your case directory and type WEC-Sim.m into the WEC-Sim command line. Upon doing so, WEC-Sim.m will clear the variables that it needs to reinitialize the simulation. It's possible that this will delete wanted outputs from previous runs, so make sure to save what you need before rerunning. Within WEC-Sim.m, it will then call the subfunction initialize WEC-Sim. This will read the WEC-Sim input file, perform a bunch of pre-processing calculations that are needed in the object classes that will be initialized in the WEC-Sim input file, and then it will select and initialize the variant subsystems that will determine the execution pathways within your Simulink model. And finally, although you won't actually see the block diagram open, it will run the time domain simulation of your Simulink model in the background. These are just .m files, so you can look at them the same way you would any other .m file via the MATLAB command edit. And if you're interested in a more high-level overview of the code execution, I encourage you to check out the Theory and Workflow section of our training materials, as the remainder of this presentation will delve more into the code objects themselves. The WEC-Sim objects that are initialized in your WEC-Sim input file can be found in the Objects subdirectory of your WEC-Sim source directory, and the list of all of the current object classes that are contained in the WEC-Sim distribution shown there at the lower right. You'll note that not all of these objects actually affect what's happening within the simulation itself. In particular, note that the response class is used to generate the output structure once a WEC-Sim run finishes. A few other of these are related in particular to advanced features. At a minimum, you'll have to define a simulation class, waves class, body, PTO, or a constraint in order to run a WEC-Sim simulation. And this basically is a requirement that you define the waves, the body interacting with the waves, and any constraints on that body, along with the simulation parameters that you are desiring. Of course, you can add additional objects to define whatever sort of WEC or floating system you would like to simulate. These are all .m files. You can view their help files using the dot command, or the code itself using the open or edit command. I would like to point you towards the user manual for details on each of these classes, and we also have particular training materials for the body class and the wave class, which may be of particular interest to you. Using the methods and properties of the objects that you've defined in your WEC-Sim input file, that information will be used to populate the blocks that are used in your Simulink model that correspond to these objects. These blocks are found in the lib subdirectory of your WEC-Sim source directory. All of the objects that can be present in a simulation as a block are shown there at the lower right, and you'll notice that they are almost one-to-one in terms of names with their corresponding objects that are presented in the WEC-Sim input file. You'll use these blocks to define your WEC dynamics, perhaps the number of bodies, the constraints that are used to attach one body to another, the presence of any moorings, etc., etc. These objects within the Simulink model are all custom masks. So if you're unfamiliar, that means to view the blocks that are underneath these top-level blocks, you'll want to press Control-U when the block is highlighted within your Simulink model. Note that because all of these blocks rely on information in the WEC-Sim input file, it's important that for every block that is present in the Simulink model, there's a line of code or several lines of code, as the case may be, in the WEC-Sim input file that describe its parameters. If you use a block in your Simulink model that is not defined in your WEC-Sim input file, you're likely to get a compilation error. Now, within these Simulink object blocks, there are a number of blocks that call custom MATLAB functions that are included with the WEC-Sim repository. These functions can be found in the subdirectory indicated at the right-hand side of the screen. And you'll notice if you open up the corresponding block in the Simulink model, it will be mostly empty and just call this external M function. That's to facilitate version control within the Simulink model itself. And if you do need to change these functions at all, the correct place to do it is on the external M file, not the function call in the Simulink block itself. We'll take a few seconds to look at this other subdirectory, the mask subdirectory. Most of these functions are initialization scripts for the Simulink block objects in Simulink if you're using an advanced functionality that has a completely different workflow and allows you to run the model from the Simulink graphical user interface and specify parameters as inputs on the block itself, much like you would in a more traditional Simulink workflow. If you're interested in this functionality, I'd refer you to the advanced features documentation noted at the bottom of the screen, but we will not be talking further about it here. Now that we've covered the WEC-Sim object files and described how they relate to the model files that you will create for your WEC-Sim model, we'll go into more detail on the model files themselves. As mentioned on a previous slide, the model files are housed in your case directory and comprise the WEC-Sim input file, the Simulink model, and some subdirectories containing the hydrodynamic data and geometric data of your model. If you're going to execute WEC-Sim, you should be in the case directory you wish to run. The first of the model files we'll go into detail about is the WEC-Sim input file, which lives here in a case directory. If you're using the default WEC-Sim workflow, where you run from the command line, this is a necessary file. I'll refer you again to the advanced features of running from Simulink if you would desire an alternate workflow. This is the file in which we initialize and define all of the classes that will be used in our WEC-Sim simulation. And of those classes, you can only have one simulation class and one wave class per simulation, but that simulation can consist of multiple bodies, PTOs, and constraints. Here we're looking at an example of the WEC-Sim input file. In this case, the example is from the RM3 example subdirectory of the WEC-Sim code. We'll notice that the WEC-Sim input file is naturally subdivided into a number of sections. Firstly, we initialize the simulation class, and we set the properties of the simulation, like the preferred solver and the time step. Then we define the wave class. In this case, we're defining regular waves along with its period and height as specified. Next, we initialize the body class with one instance for each body that we wish to simulate. For these RM3 examples, there are two bodies, a float and a heave plate. Here we also specify the mass properties of each body individually, and potentially other properties like drag as well. Note, however, by default, geometric properties like their displaced volume and their position in space relative to each other are specified in the H5 file that each body is calling when the body class is initialized. This H5 file will come from your boundary element method code, and I refer you to the online training materials on Vimeo for more information there. Finally, we initialize the constraint and the power takeoff or PTO class, which constrains the body's motion in space relative to each other and relative to the global simulation reference frame. Note that that global simulation reference frame itself is actually initialized when the simulation class is initialized. And I'll note one more time, this method of specifying parameters is the default in the default workflow. If you'd wish to run from the Simulink graphical user interface, I refer you to the relevant advanced features documentation. So now that we've looked at the example WEC-Sim input file for the RM3 example, we'll move on and do the same for the Simulink model file. This is also found in the case directory, and it is going to be defined by dragging and dropping the WEC-Sim library blocks into the requisite Simulink file. We'll note here that the information contained in the WEC-Sim input file maps to a particular block or a particular object in the Simulink file. The simulation parameters are contained in the global reference frame block. Because the wave acts on the bodies that are present in the simulation, the information in the wave class initialization is passed to a calculation that takes place within each of the body blocks. The mass information as well is passed to each body block respectively, body 1 and body 2 in this example. The constraint class is passed to this constraint block that acts in this case between body 2 and the global reference frame. In this case, the motion is going to be constrained in heave, surge, and pitch. Finally, the PTO information contained in PTO class is passed to the translational PTO block that constrains the motion here between body 1 and body 2 to be strictly in the Z or heave direction. If you're using the advanced features workflow, instead of a WEC-Sim input file, you'll input all relevant parameters directly to the block itself by double-clicking on the block's image. Now we'll talk a little bit about the relationships between the code objects, their variables represented in the MATLAB workspace, and the kinds of parameters they affect within the Simulink simulation. This is a familiar slide we've seen once before. Just a reminder that all of the MATLAB object code is contained in this subdirectory in the WEC-Sim source directory. Among a few others that are advanced features, WEC-Sim uses these classes. Each class contains methods. These are variables that can be defined or calculated, or methods, which are essentially functions that can be executed provided that the object has previously been initialized. Upon initialization, the exact properties and methods that are utilized to populate the parameters of a block are determined by specifications in the user's WEC-Sim input file. After initialization, the object will appear with a very intuitive name in your MATLAB workspace. Note that the actual execution pathway that's followed in the Simulink model is controlled through variant subsystems, which are specified by some parameters within these classes. An example is body-to-body interactions contained in the simulation class, specifying a body as a non-hydro or drag body, which is a parameter in the body class, as well as the wave force calculation method. For example, regular waves or irregular waves have their forces calculated differently. We'll now look at a few examples of WEC-Sim classes in detail. We'll start with the simulation class. All of the properties of the simulation class are shown there on the right-hand side of the screen. And you'll note that they pertain mostly to the parameters of execution of the WEC-Sim Simulink model, like solver time and solver type. Many of these parameters have default values that you don't need to worry about specifying. However, it at minimum requires a sim mechanics file, that's the Simulink model you'd wish to execute, a simulation start time, end time, and time step, as well as a ramp time, that's the time over which the wave force is ramped up from 0 to its maximum value, and the CIC end time, which is the length of time over which a convolution integral, which theoretically continues to infinity, will be calculated. We'll move on to the wave class now. The wave class has its own online training materials that are available. We'll just be briefly going through the basics here. The properties of the wave class are shown at the right-hand side of the screen. And you'll notice that the wave class has all of the information that's necessary to calculate the incident wave height throughout your simulated domain. And then we can use this wave height to determine the forces that are acting on your bodies through information contained in the body class blocks. Depending on the wave type you've specified, it has more or less required properties. This is where a user can import their own wave spectrum or their own wave elevation time series if they wish. They can also use a variety of built-in regular and irregular wave spectra. This is the body class. It's another example of one that has its own set of detailed online training materials. We'll only be covering the basics here. The properties of the body class are shown at the right-hand side of the screen. The user, when initializing this class, will need to specify either a mass value or a couple of different flags, the inertia and products of inertia, a geometry file. This is typically an STL file that is used for visualization and some advanced features, as well as an H5 file. This latter is very important because it contains all of the hydrodynamic information from a boundary element method code output, as well as some basic layout information like the locations of the center of gravity. We'll now describe the Constraint and PTO classes because they have a number of similar functionalities, and fundamentally they are both used to constrain motions between bodies or bodies in the global reference frame. Firstly, the constraint block, whose parameters are shown in the upper right, requires simply a name and a location of application before it is defined in the WEC-Sim Simulink model. The PTO class, because it is also able to prescribe the coupling forces exerted along the non-constrained degree of freedom, has a number of additional parameters like the stiffness, damping, as well as potentially pretension. To prescribe an external force that is applied via a mooring system attached to a WEC body, power takeoff, or constraint, use the mooring class. The mooring class has two methods associated with it, a mooring matrix, which parameters are linear and shown down at the lower right, or as an advanced feature, a Moordyne link that is used to describe much more complicated mooring systems. Here we'll only be talking about the former of those, the linear mooring matrix. It requires a name, location, and the stiffness, damping, and pretension values to be defined before it is utilized in the WEC-Sim model. The cable class is used to describe the coupling of a compliant cable, tether, or rope between two constraints or power takeoffs. The degrees of freedom available to the end of this cable, tether, or rope are defined by the particular constraint or PTO to which it is attached. If the cable is not in tension, it will not transmit forces between the two connection points. The cable has the minimum required properties of the stiffness and damping associated with the cable material properties. However, it has a variety more shown at the right hand of the screen that can be specified to determine things like pretension and initial orientation. The response class is unique in that it is not initialized by the user in the WEC-Sim input file. Instead, it is created at the end of a WEC-Sim simulation and saved to your workspace as an output variable. Output is an instance of the response class, and it contains all of the time series from your simulation, as well as some methods to allow you to interact with those results quickly. All of the properties of this response class instance are the defined other objects in your simulation, like your PTOs, your bodies, your constraints. You'll note that These subfields may exist in your output class even if you don't have them in your WEC-Sim input file, but don't worry, those output fields will then be empty. This structure is defined before user-defined functions is called, so anything you'd like in your user-defined functions can reference the output structure. We'll now transition to looking at the Simulink blocks that are contained in the WEC-Sim library. This is a reminder that the WEC-Sim library blocks live in the lib subdirectory of the WEC-Sim source directory. If we open up the WEC-Sim section of the Simulink library browser, you can see an image like that on the right. Each of the different object classes like bodies, moorings, and PTOs will appear as their own subheading, and you can drag and drop blocks from here to build your WEC-Sim model. You might notice as you do so that a number will automatically be assigned to repeated blocks of the same type. And this is because Simulink models are not allowed to have two blocks with an identical name. So looking at the Simulink model file, you'll notice the screenshot of the RM3 example there at the far right, and you could see how one could drag and drop blocks from the WEC-Sim library to construct your Simulink model. Because this model lives in Simulink Simscape, feel free to incorporate any other functionality that is afforded, like control systems or other useful blocks in the Simscape library. The Simulink model of your WEC is going to be structured as a number of variant subsystems. This allows multiple execution pathways to be contained within a common top-level WEC-Sim library block. The proper execution pathway is going to be determined at runtime based upon user-specified parameters in your WEC-Sim input file. The actual programmatic specification of this happens towards the end of initialize WEC-Sim.m. The image on the right is an example of a variant subsystem. We're currently one level down within the top-level body block, and depending on the value of the argument body.nhbody, non-hydro body for short, one of three blocks will be connected and utilized, the first of which uses all hydrodynamic forces, and the middle of which, a non-hydrodynamic body, uses only mass and hydrostatics. So hopefully you now have an impression of how the WEC-Sim code all fits together. So in conclusion, we'll step through the high-level WEC-Sim workflow one more time, and you can see how all these pieces fit. This figure shows a high-level view of the WEC-Sim workflow. You can see the various Simulink objects that we discussed, the Simulink model, blue block in the middle, and the classes that are initialized in the WEC-Sim input file in the WEC-Sim input file green box here in the middle. The first step any user will need to do is to generate their mesh from which they can run a boundary element method solver to get their hydrodynamic coefficients. These are the hydrodynamic coefficients contained in the H5 file that is read by the body class. Next, a user will build their WEC-Sim model in Simulink by opening the WEC-Sim library browser and dragging and dropping the library blocks as we showed a few slides ago. Alongside their WEC-Sim model in Simulink, they'll create a WEC-Sim input file, being sure that every block that was specified in their Simulink model is initialized properly in their WEC-Sim input file. Finally, the user will execute WEC-Sim from the command line. Then the user will execute WEC-Sim, probably from the command line. This will read the WEC-Sim input file, which will activate the specified variant subsystems needed by the Simulink model, as well as initialize all of the class objects that we discussed in this presentation. Then using these initialized classes and variant subsystems, WEC-Sim.m will run the WEC-Sim Simulink model that we've built using blocks in our WEC-Sim Simulink library. After the Simulink model finishes running, a response class object will be made as an output structure in the MATLAB workspace. This MATLAB structure can be used in your user-defined functions to perform calculations, generate plots, or whatever you would like. Thank you for joining me for this presentation on the WEC-Sim CodeStructure. All of our webinar training materials and recordings are available online at this website. I encourage you to look at them, particularly the body class, wave class implementation, as well as a number of advanced features that were referenced in this presentation. Thank you for your time. This has been Dominic Forbush of Sandia National Laboratories.